start here, and I'm just going to quickly revamp what I've done. I'm going to cover the first couple of slides, and then we're going to go through to plot and perspective readings today, where we've got 6 readings. We've got question instructions, both in the PowerPoint and under tasks in the overview. And you've got your last task, which is to do a reading and think about some of the issues of plot and perspective and why they're important, both for the genre and other genres, and of course, in terms of intercultural learning, which is a sort of sub-theme today that I'm not going to push, but if we don't get a chance, we'll have a chance later to just run through that. So I started off looking at today's subject and flagged The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole, age 13 3/4. Need to be exact about age there, of course, as being a sort of seminal, as in sort of genre-defining work in this area. Well worth checking out. There are links and it's all available online. I then pointed out that lots of background noise here. Fictional diaries are sort of an amalgamation of lots of different genres. There are things such as memoirs, which is a writer sort of remembering events or a record of events. It doesn't have to be sort of chronologically organized in just a straight story format like a diary is. That's the difference between a memoir, say, for example, and a journal or a diary, because a journal or diary is written at regular intervals. And what this implies is that to a degree it follows a story rather than a plot. It's not reconstructed. Which is something that several of our authors play upon, like Sherman Alexie, for example. An autobiography and biography, story of somebody's life written by somebody else or by themselves, and you can wonder to what degree that makes them a reliable or unreliable narrator. Whether it's reconstructed and retold rather like a journal to try and make it appear as a story without any messing about. We'll look at story and plot a bit later. Or whether it's reconstructed as a memoir more clearly. And then I also flagged up for autographics or autographical novels, which a lot of these also can fall under as a genre. Which sort of combine the idea of, if you look at the frontispiece, the front title cover page to A Diary of a Wimpy Kid, it's a novel told in cartoons, I think it says there. So you've got this combination of both sort of, some sort of autobiography or journal diary combined with the graphic novel format, not a genre. Next slide, I introduced the idea of narrative point of view, which we've touched on and I've been mentioning because we kind of know some of these things and I've seen people using them. We can look at this sort of idea of internal narrator, which we can pick up on from a lot of our books already, where somebody inside the story is telling the story. It's a character in the story. Often and normally it will be a first-person narrator, the I that tells the story, and that will then be the protagonist. But an internal narrator could also be any character telling somebody else's story. Typically, a protagonist will then, and a first-person narrator will then tell a story from somebody else's perspective for them. So that's still a sort of another sort of way of structuring a story within itself internally. So that's one thing we can look for. And if we don't have an internal narrator, then there are different terms, but we have different types of third-person narrators. An omniscient or all-knowing narrator. I don't know why my screen just sort of dulled slightly. Something might have happened. Potentially will be a third-person narrator who's not a character in the story. and therefore seems to know everything that's going on in the story. A sort of God complex going on, if you will, here. Um, very typical of 19th century fiction, not very typical of modern fiction, unless you have what's called a frame narrative. People are set up as omniscient narrators, normally to be undermined later. Very often, this is quite common in adult fiction and postmodern fiction. But we've got this idea of somebody outside the story telling the story. They can then go between different people's perspectives as and when. An omniscient narrator normally has a voice, and I try to go into your work and point this out as well, so you can normally notice them because they tend to make comments and add things that you couldn't possibly know otherwise. So that's as opposed to a limited narrator, often called limited third person narrator, who's not a character in the story and is not a character outside the story either, but is rather like a camera viewing pointed at the action, at the events in the story. So you tend to see things through the eyes of a single character because the camera becomes a character. We'll be looking at these later, and you're going to be applying them to your examples. They're very important, and I've already started applying them to what you've been doing before. So it's a very good opportunity to think about these things. We'll be also doing it after the break and next week as well, working with ideas of narrative perspective. So I've mentioned this already. Sometimes a journal or a diary might seem to be simply a story and not a plot. And these words are often interchanged, so it's worth having a look at and thinking about what is a story, what's a plot. A story is simply, as Homer Simpson says in The Simpsons, it's just a bunch of stuff that happens. It's a series of events in chronological order. And that's all it is. They're not reordered. They're stuff that happens in sequence in a right order of time. And that's a story. So often, and I think that's what Sherman Alexia is playing with as well, because a diary gives you, here's the day, here's what happens. It presents itself as a story, but then obviously it's not a story because it selects, and that selection is plot. Okay, plot is a series of events deliberately or premeditatedly either arranged or rearranged, normally after a sort of like logical cause and effect order. Yeah, so this happens, which means this happens. That will be done by the writer. And so in some of our examples, we need to question what is story and what is plot, and what is the narrator doing? Are they reliable, and what are they telling us? So the plot could then be sort of could show the significance of events, the action, if you will, and that's called dramatic significance. And in lots of action stuff and dramas, you find very tight plots with this happens, which causes that to happen, which means that happens. That's very important. We could also have thematic significance, and this could happen quite a lot in a diary where the events don't have to be tightly plotted one after the other, but they could be chosen or selected in like a diary or a journal because they have meaning for the character in a particular theme, whether it's the development of their friendship with a certain character or a conflict that they're understanding. So that's another important way of sort of thinking about how things might develop and how a plot might organize story. Could also have purely emotional significance, which is typical as well for a first person diary as well, because it's about the development of your emotional state and feelings. That might also be linked towards a character, for example, a best friend, or a setting, for example, a school and your life in school. Story and plot and what they do. So you often have single plots, and in a lot of these early books, we have got single as opposed to multiple plots, often with a single perspective, because we're dealing with a protagonist. In fact, there are people that argue that most stories really are about a single plot line and a single conflict with a single character, always a single protagonist. However, you can also have, this is as much to sort of begin to explore some of the terms involved. You can have main plot lines and subplots. And that means the main plot lines are the important ones, often involving the protagonist, and the subplots might be of lesser importance. You can draw some good examples from some of the books where, for example, the sister in The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian is kind of a subplot, though it is still important to the main plot line. However, it's a sort of secondary plot line that is of lesser importance. We can talk about things being, and have talked about things being, tightly plotted. Tight plotting means you've got a strong causal and logical order of everything. No unnecessary information is in there at all. In fact, our fairy tale, which we explored in our opening two module and couple of sessions, is typical of something like this, which is tightly plotted. You're not going to get anything unnecessary in there at all. It's almost pure plot. And then we've got this idea of closed structure. So in a fairy tale, nothing is left unresolved. It's tightly plotted. Normally we have a single plot line, which is our main plot line, no subplots. Nothing unnecessary is told, rather like Philip Pullman, if you remember back, saying, there's no unnecessary information, not even description. And at the end, everything is resolved in the resolution. There are nothing's left open. And what a tight plot is good at doing is, because everything is necessarily pointing to what could, or expectation, predictions of what can or might or may not happen in the plot, it's very good at building suspense, as opposed to other forms of plotting. Say, for example, if something is loosely plotted, like it's more thematic, it covers diverse development about feelings. It could be episodic, which we'll look at as well, where it's just separate little unrelated episodes picked out. And this doesn't develop sort of tension and suspense in the same way that tightly plotted action movie does, because everything happens boom, boom, bam, which is a bit like a fairy tale. And that often leads to then an open-ended plot as opposed to a closed structure, which means things are left unresolved. Now, often, tightly plotted action films might leave deliberately one single plot line open and open-ended to carry on over into the next film or text or book. But you can also look at realistic fiction, for example, might leave things completely open-ended. And a diary, really, when you think about it, if it's going to be unmediated and like a story, then of course it should be loosely plotted, because nobody's life is tightly plotted, though some of you might argue against that. And things are always left unresolved and open-ended. So we've got that sort of main conflict between story, just a bunch of stuff that happens, and plot, how we put meaning into it by reorganizing it to make sense. So it's a sense-making activity. Don't worry, there's a lot of information here, but I'm just going to do this short presentation, and then I don't expect you to know all of this, but there's quite a lot of useful ideas that you can consider or begin to consider, and we'll work with them this afternoon and next time, and course requirements, etc. Dramatic, 4 sort of basic types of plot structure that we'll look at today very quickly. And I've got some pictures to help you, and you can look at them afterwards and sort of consider them. Dramatic plot. Number 1. Number 2, episodic plot. Number 3, parallel plot or multiple plots. And number 4, the flashback plot. What's a dramatic plot structure? Well, there's a good little sort of schema over it over here. It's got a chronological structure. It doesn't sort of hop about between times. It's got a strong linear time aspect, chronological structure. In the beginning, it establishes setting and character, and then a conflict. We'll have a look at conflict in a minute as well. Then we have rising action to a climax, also known as a turning point, and then a denouement to the finish, where everything is wrapped up tidily, particularly here where a denouement points to something being tightly plotted, and if it comes to a clear finish, that's a closed structure. Shaboom. Okay, complete story, no need for anything else. So that's the dramatic plot structure, and as you can imagine, a fairy tale would probably fit well to this. An action movie with a single point of climax, normally the turning point, might fit this. This could be a simplification, because you might come to a climax, anticlimax, and then greater climax. You think everything's finished. No, it's not. That's a very typical structure as well, and that's a variation on the dramatic plot structure, where you get a false climax, then you get a new, even greater climax. Episodes, an episodic plot structure. It is linear and chronological. You can see over here. I'm thinking of any sort of voyage, journey movie, travel writing. Generally lends itself very well to sort of this kind of structure. An episodic plot is a sort of series of loosely connected incidents or episodes, often chapter length. And as opposed to having dramatic significance, they tend to have thematic significance. They tend to be tied together because they have meaning together, or something that points to a final meaning, or and they could also be tied together by characters, whether it's a single character that's the thread running through it, and therefore it could also have emotional significance, that charting the sort of development of a single character through what's called a maturation plot. It's a really, really good question, because plot structures are open to interpretation. Is Part-Time Indian episodic, or is it reconstructed? There's parts of it where you could see, because each section of an episodic plot is kind of like a mini dramatic plot in itself, isn't it? But they do have the final sort of turning point. Yeah, that boss. Oh, sorry, I don't know if I should be giving away what happens at the end at this point. Is that a spoiler alert? There is a sort of climax. It seems to be more thematic for me than dramatic. There's lots of dramatic climaxes. I'd say that if you were to, I think there are strong arguments to say that it is kind of episodic. I think you can't just state that. You'd need to explain what you mean by that. Then you can have something where you see it's episodic in its episodes, but does have an overall thematic climax as well, and maybe that's what happens. What this does is it allows you to then explore characters, setting, which is crucial, and very often a lot of sort of more diary style things do have episodic structures, because they take single events, they then try and tie them together in terms of emotional development or thematic significance. And they're very good at a time and place, a period, a character in a specific way of life, which is again very much what Part-Time Indian is doing. So I'd probably support your ideas there. These are not, people tend to always put twists on some of these standard structures. Parallel or multiple plots, they can be at different times. Think of science fiction, for example, which we're going to go on to later, but they do generally run in the same direction, don't have to. The film Memento by Chris Nolan is a really good example of a parallel plot structure where one plot runs backwards and the other plot runs forwards. I don't know if you've seen Memento. The end result is incredibly intellectually stimulating, but emotionally and thematically incredibly confusing. So there's a lot of arguments to say that parallel plots kind of need to very often run in one direction, but they don't have to. Lindy, you were reading Bleak House. That's a classic parallel plot structure. In one version, you get Esther's narrative, which is in the past and chronologically ordered. And then in between, you get a sort of different voice with an omniscient narrator. And it all seems to be in the present or in all time. So you get two different sort of time structures. Really, really exciting and complex book, important for science fiction. I'd have to say Bleak House, strangely enough, in terms of its complex structure. Very often this could be two or more interwoven dramatic plots that reach to a climax, though they can have very different relationships, and they should then also be tied together dramatically, but can also be tied together by a common theme and or characters. You can think of Babel or Four Stories, for example, where you get four stories in one film or a book, and they have some kind of significance or overlap. Perhaps the characters meet each other in each story or walk past each other. That's a typical sort of multiple plot structure where you sort of have four vignettes or a number of vignettes, and in some way they touch into each other's stories potentially. So this has been explored at length, I'd have to say. It's a fantastic and interesting way of looking at plots, not used a great deal, I have to say, in young adult fiction. And these can be used to heighten suspense. They certainly might be used in Gothic. So we have to reevaluate a story, and they can show the story from different perspectives and with different narrative perspectives and techniques, and can reveal subtext, which means meaning, implicit meaning, but often something that the characters don't know that we do. Sorry, that's the wrong title. I do apologize. This is the Flashback Plot, often described as in media res, in the middle of things. So they provide a sort of episodic subplot that reveals information about the main plot. So you get this sort of constant going back to events in the past, as you can see here, running up to the final end in December 2002. So that's, as you can see, the overall, it's kind of part of the same thing. You get a setting, then a second setting. You've got a conflict that rises to a climax with some sort of denouement. This is also very common technique, mostly due to cinema being very good at opening up flashbacks to simultaneous presence, because you're always in the present tense with the camera, aren't you? And it allows you to run two times at the same time, not knowing how they're going to then play together, how the subplot might feed into the main plot, or which might even be the main or the subplot. Normally you have to have quite a clear structure to show a flashback. Flashback plot structure, sorry. This is number 4. I don't know how that got into this. Must have been uploaded. That's, if we go back to there, this should say flashback. There we go. So this is the flashback structure. I'll get that out of shot there. So this is also very, very effective form of, it's like a parallel multiple plot structure as well, but with a very specific technique. Films, it can be quite confusing with a limited narrator to then go back and run 2 times because they're both in the present tense. A book can also do that, of course. So, 4 techniques: the dramatic plot. Let's go back there and make this quite clear. The episodic plot. These are not written in stone. These are just ideas around how text might be modeled. Parallel or multiple plots. Flashback plot, number 4. I'm going to ask you now to have a look at readings in your groups, as you were already, and complete task 2. There are some conventions, which I'm actually going to flip through quite quickly. Memoirs could just be one event or aspect of a life. Retrospective account, very important. Could be a fictionalized memoir, which is what we're dealing with here as well, in order to deal with some sort of aspect which is quite traumatic. Diaries and journals, you can see there, Wednesday, dated. In that sense, we've got that sort of almost sense of story as it unfolds, but it never is, of course, because even at the end of the day, when you write your journal, it's not in the present tense. It's still a way of reconstructing the past. Let's have a look. Autobiography, first-person account, highly personalized, therefore unreliable as a narrator, and may be supported, like the Chris Riddell books, with pictures and newspaper articles, which is maybe the aspect of the fake sort of memoir or biography of Ottoline does. And really, I suppose when we think about it, diaries and journals are very useful as a genre, because it's also a format that is used in Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and so they play out naturally in a digital setting. Whether you can recreate episodes in some sort of diary, fictional diary, and do them as YouTube films, there's no end of potential here. Some theories, here's a novel in cartoons. Point out here are 4 important points to consider or to think about. Subject to diaries is often Bildungsroman, growing up, and then the themes that are related to that, often with a conflict or overcoming a difficulty, as we're seeing here as well, whether it's a physical disfigurement, wimpiness. A lot of our fictional diaries have very similar themes like that. Character and setting, this sense of time and place. But if I've got to pick on 4 aspects that I think are really important, it's the first person account. It's their version of the story, i.e. a plot. And that's quite important. To some degrees, how the reliability of the narrator is key. And the very fact that it is unreliable means we have to really sort of empathize with the individual, and that's the main act, and that's what makes it so important in terms of intercultural learning, which I probably won't have time to touch on in great depth today, but you can look at further on in the PowerPoint how diaries and fictional accounts, particularly fictional diaries, are very useful in terms of intercultural learning. They're often termed as fragmented or intercalated. You can just ignore that first bit. Fragmented narratives. So things are often missing from the story, where you jump in a diary. As you can imagine, there's a couple of days where you don't bother to do much, or then you recall things which are from a few days ago. So it's got this naturally fragmented element as a narrative, which plays in with this reliability issue, because it's supposed to be a story unfolding as it happens, but it never is in terms of a journal or a diary. Point 3 that's well worth considering and remembering is who's it for? And of course, the intended reader audience of a diary is the writer, and it's got this self-reflexive aspect, and really important to remember as well that technically a diary is not really for anybody else as an audience, and that is quite an important point. Fourthly, that one theme of writing of a diary is the act of writing in a diary and the process of writing in a diary, and what that entails and why you write in a diary. So normally in a diary as well, the audience, the reader's constantly reminded of it being a diary, of how its constructedness, and this has strong interplay with the intended reader as the writer, with the fragmented narrative, the idea of plot and plotting and selection and perspective from the first person as well. So these all play into making the diary a compelling genre. And often here we can see Diary of a Wimpy Kid. It's presented almost as a sort of as a straightforward title, but then we can see later when we look at the absolutely true diary of a part-time Indian that the constructedness and unreliability of the diary is actually brought into the paratext and into the title, interestingly. There is the absolutely true diary of a part-time Indian with its cowboys and Indians figurines on the front. So the question would be, what are we going to do now until 11:45? I'd like you to go into your same groups with your same single diary focus or coming of age book focus. And I'd like you to look at a set of questions which are not exactly the same here in the PowerPoint, which was done at a different time to the task. So we need to look at a raft of angles, and it's important that we cover them. Who tells the story and what kind of narrator are they? Is very important indeed. Secondly, do we see the story from the same perspective or point of view as the narration? And that's quite important as well. We've worked on this already, the idea that we're seeing one thing and we're being told. So we've got the narration and we've got the showing on the other hand, the verbal and the visual text. Is the narrator reliable? If so, why? If not, why not? Then obviously, though you're going to be doing a reading, you might consider the entire book as far as you've read it or what you know, what kind of plot structure or structures can you identify. If you haven't read that, haven't sort of got the book already or just looked at the books and then gone online and read a bit of it so you're up to date or watched the film, what do you expect? Or you can compare between both film and book. Then, very importantly, what evidence of the theme of writing a diary and can you find, because this is quite an important detail in this section. And who is the intended audience reader? I know I've just told you that fictional diaries are generally aimed at a writer, but this can also be played on and with in the genre. I think if I look at tasks as well, over here as well, I've said it in slightly different terms. Who's the narrator? What's the POV perspective? I've also asked this question, what's the story and what's the plot, to differentiate between the two. I also prompted this question, what do we learn about Indigenous peoples? I heard some of you talking about this already. And interestingly enough, Indigenous peoples are obviously part of every population. And how do fiction and fictional diaries promote intercultural learning? You can probably point down to classroom contexts and for potential reasons why this might be so. Okay, so there we have a raft of questions. I'm going to set you up now for task. I've underneath, under perspective readings, I've got an excerpt to base your reading upon. You can draw from other stuff in the book as well, or leaf through the books. They're all sort of to a degree, or a lot of them are autographic novels, we could say as well, because they've got strong iconotextual and visual elements. But I've collated or collected opening chapters because, as I've explained to many of you many times, I think you can read chapter one of a book normally available online and watch the film and get a really clear idea of plot, perspective, character, and setting. You might not get all the subjects and themes of a book, though you can probably guess them from it. There's the Pepper Pot building in Otterline. That's the first entry from Diary of a Wimpy Kid. You see, I just accessed it online because I didn't have my written copy with me. There's the opening line, I was born with water on the brain, of the absolutely true Diary of a Part-Time Indian. There's chapter one, I shouldn't have come to this party. Pay attention to tense in The Hate You Give. That's the opening chapter. And there's Oggie's opening, Ordinary. I know I'm not an ordinary 10-year-old kid to wonder. Okay, I'm going to ask you now to go into your groups. And task 2, we're discussing particularly plot and perspective. There is, you can continue in your same Google Docs doc. You have got until 11:45. So you've got good 45 minutes to complete the task. So if you feel you're ready at the end and want to summarize, you can record your session. You can summarize in writing as well. I'll be coming around, and so that's negotiable according to what you feel your groups can or can't do. But there should be a written basis at all times, so you've got something you can refer back to. Question on the text wall. Annika, we're doing science fiction after lunch today. How awesome's that? Goodbye, YouTubers. I am coming out of this recording.